The Chase Center press room had the familiar energy of a convincing Warriors victory. 128 to 112 over the Lakers. Steph Curry had played like the old days. 35 points, 8 assists, 4 steals. It was supposed to be just another post-game press conference on a Friday night in San Francisco. Until Harvey Levin quietly entered through the back door. The air conditioning hummed softly, mixing with the low murmur of conversations between journalists adjusting their cameras and checking their notes. The familiar smell of cold coffee and the electric energy post-victory created that atmosphere Steph had known for more than a decade. You can tell there was genuine lightness in the air when Steph entered the room, still in his sweaty uniform, the wide smile that always appeared after victories like that one. He greeted some familiar reporters with waves, made a joke with the ESPN cameraman about the new camera, and settled into the familiar chair behind the microphone. Naturally, this leads us to the moment when everything was perfectly normal, until it stopped being so. Steph, talk about that sequence in the third quarter, when you opened up a 17-point lead, began Maria Santos from ESPN, her pen sliding across the notepad as she spoke. Steph leaned into the microphone, relaxed. Well, Maria, I think we managed to find our defensive rhythm. When we stop their transitions and force elaborate plays, our defense becomes much more solid. The questions flowed as they always flowed. Technique, strategy, playoff preparation. Danny Martinez from The Athletic asked about chemistry with new players. Jennifer Walsh from NBC Sports Bay Area wanted to know about adjustments for the next game. The sound of cameras clicking created that familiar soundtrack of media events. Steph gestured while explaining plays, laughed when someone made an intelligent observation, demonstrated the genuine passion he always had in talking about the sport he loved. For 20 minutes, it was just another post-victory press conference. For 20 minutes, the world made sense. But there was a reason that night was different. On the previous Wednesday, TMZ had published a story that was causing a furor on social media. Photos of Steph and Isha in an apparently tense conversation in the parking lot of a restaurant in Palo Alto. The hashtag #CurryDivorce had dominated worldwide trending topics for 2 consecutive days. TMZ had published the photos with the title "Trouble in Paradise. Steph and Isha Curry in tense discussion suggests marriage crisis." The internet had done what the internet does best: transform a photo out of context into unbridled speculation. There were no facts. There were no confirmed sources. Just an image frozen in time and collective imagination creating narratives. Steph's phone hadn't stopped ringing since Wednesday. His mother, Sonia, called concerned, after neighbors asked if she was okay. Del, his father, sent messages saying he was receiving calls from friends wanting to know if it was true. Even Seth, his brother, sent a text. "Dude, what's going on? Mom is worried." For 2 days, Thursday and Friday, other tabloids picked up the narrative and began adding imaginary layers. Sources close to the couple reveal growing tensions. Friends say Steph has been spending more time away from home. It's speculated that career pressures are affecting the relationship. Each headline was more invasive than the previous one, and all of them based absolutely on nothing beyond that single photo. It was then that you noticed a subtle change in the room's energy. A tall, thin figure had entered discreetly during a question about player rotation. Perfectly styled gray hair, designer glasses, a presence that occupied space even while trying to go unnoticed. Harvey Levin had arrived. Marcus Williams, Steph's advisor for 6 years, was sitting in the front row beside the press table when he felt his stomach contract as if he'd taken a punch. His eyes met Steph's for a fraction of a second, and both knew exactly what that presence meant. Some of the veteran reporters noticed too. Have you ever wondered how a room can change atmosphere without a single word being spoken? It was as if the temperature had dropped a few degrees, as if the air had become denser, harder to breathe. Harvey didn't sit immediately. He stood at the back of the room, observing, calculating, waiting for the right moment. He was an experienced predator, and experienced predators know that timing is everything. Sarah Mitchell, a 15-year Associated Press veteran covering the NBA, was asking a question about mental preparation for playoffs when she noticed Harvey. Her words stumbled slightly, as if she had lost her train of thought for a second. "Sorry, Steph, you were saying about mental preparation." Steph had also noticed the arrival. His posture changed imperceptibly, shoulders slightly more tense, smile still present, but now more controlled than spontaneous. It was like watching a lion that had detected a strange scent in the wind. "Sure, Sarah. I think mental preparation is about maintaining focus on what we control." His response was technically perfect, but there was an underlying layer of attention that wasn't there before. The clock on the wall showed 9:22 p.m. Under normal conditions, the press conference would be ending in a few minutes. But nothing about that night was being normal. Something that touches deeply is how you can feel danger approaching even when there's still no logical reason for it. The entire room was beginning to perceive that something different was happening, even if they didn't know exactly what. Harvey finally moved, walking slowly along the side of the room until he found a strategic position. Not too close to draw attention, but with perfect angle to make direct eye contact when his turn came. Connor Smith from the San Francisco Chronicle asked the next question about defensive strategies, but his gaze kept drifting to Harvey. Jennifer Walsh checked her list of questions, but her hands moved more nervously than before. Steph answered two more questions, maintaining the impeccable professionalism that characterized him, but anyone who knew him well could perceive the subtle change. The relaxed post-victory energy was being replaced by something more cautious, more defensive. Marcus Williams looked at the clock. 9:27 p.m. Normally, he would have already signaled that it was time to wrap up, but Harvey Levin hadn't asked his question yet, and Steph knew exactly why the TMZ founder was there. He knew that all that speculation about his personal life, all that invasion of his family's privacy, would culminate in that moment. For 2 days, he had seen his private life dissected publicly. He had seen Isha worried about the impact on the children. Riley, at 12 years old, was already in middle school and had access to social media. Ryan, 9 years old, was asking questions that a child shouldn't have to ask. Cannon, at 4 years old, didn't understand why Mom and Dad seemed sad watching TV. "Last question," Marcus announced, his voice sounding more tense than intended. It was then that Harvey raised his hand. The silence that followed was not the normal silence of a room waiting for the next question. It was the silence of people who instinctively know they are about to witness something that shouldn't happen. Steph looked directly at Harvey for the first time. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and for a second that seemed like an eternity. It was as if only the two of them existed in that space. "Harvey," Steph said, his voice neutral but loaded with recognition. Harvey took 2 steps forward, positioning himself so that the cameras would perfectly capture both him and Steph in the same frame. 4 decades of media experience had taught him exactly how to orchestrate moments like that. What no one in the room knew, not the veteran reporters, not Marcus Williams, not even Steph himself, was that this moment would become a watershed not just for one family, but for the entire culture of privacy invasion in sports media. For 2 days, Steph had reflected on how to respond to that situation. He had considered ignoring it, had thought about denying it, had contemplated simply leaving the room. But something in his core told him this was an opportunity to educate, to establish limits, to protect not just his family, but all families that went through the same type of invasion. How many times in life have you wondered where to draw the line between legitimate curiosity and pure invasion? Steph Curry was about to show the entire world where his was. How is it possible that a 30-second question can contain so much violation? Steph was about to find out, and his response would forever change the way public figures defend their private lives. Some lines cannot be crossed, and Harvey Levin was about to learn exactly what happens when someone tries to cross them. No one could imagine that this moment would be the turning point. Harvey Levin took a deep breath, like a diver preparing for a deep descent. In 40 years of journalism career, he had asked thousands of difficult questions. But there was something different about that moment, a tension in the air that even he, veteran in creating controversies, could feel. "Steph," Harvey began, his voice cutting through the room's silence like a sharp blade, "there are persistent rumors about problems in your marriage with Isha. TMZ has sources close saying you're considering separation. Can you comment on the real state of your relationship?" What happened next cannot be adequately described with words, but only felt in the soul of anyone who has ever had something precious attacked unjustly. Silence. Not the common silence of someone formulating a response. Not the silence of surprise or confusion. It was the deep, almost spiritual silence of someone who had just seen a sacred line being crossed right in front of them. 15 seconds passed, like 15 minutes. The sound of air conditioning, previously imperceptible, now echoed through the room like a siren. You could hear people breathing. You could feel the collective discomfort like a dense fog spreading through every corner of that space. The cameras continued recording, capturing every second of that moment that would become historic for reasons that no one in the room could yet fully understand. Steph didn't look away, didn't blink excessively, didn't show anger or irritation. There was something even more powerful in his expression: absolute determination. How is it possible that a 30-second question contains so much violation? How is it possible that apparently simple words carry so much disrespect for something that should be untouchable? Marcus Williams felt his heart accelerate. In 6 years as Steph's advisor, he had seen difficult moments, complicated questions, delicate situations, but he had never witnessed anything like that. He had never felt an entire room hold its breath, as if everyone knew they were about to witness something that would change the rules of the game forever. The other reporters exchanged uncomfortable glances. Sarah Mitchell lowered her eyes to her notepad. Connor Smith crossed his arms, as if he were cold. Jennifer Walsh looked at the door as if she wanted the floor to open and swallow her, because everyone there knew, deep in their journalistic souls, that Harvey had just crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed. Everyone there knew that question wasn't about information or legitimate public curiosity. It was about entertainment at the expense of something sacred. Steph continued looking directly at Harvey, and you can perceive that something fundamental had changed, not just in that man, but in the entire environment around him. Steph Curry counted mentally to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It was the same breathing technique he used in decisive free throws, in moments when the entire game depended on his ability to stay calm under absolute pressure. But this wasn't a free throw. This was something infinitely more important than any basketball game. When he finally opened his mouth to speak, his voice came out with crystal clarity that cut through the room's silence like a ray of sunlight piercing dark clouds. There was no anger in his tone. There was no irritation or defensiveness. There was something much more powerful, unwavering determination from a man who knew exactly where to draw his lines in the sand. "Harvey," Steph began, his eyes fixed directly on the main camera, not on Harvey himself. "I'm going to answer your question once, and then I'm going to establish a limit that I hope will be respected from now on." The room remained in absolute silence. You can perceive there was an almost spiritual quality to that quietness, as if everyone present instinctively knew they were about to witness something that would be remembered for decades. "Isha and I have been married for 12 years, Steph continued, each word measured and deliberate. "Like any real couple, we face challenges. Like any real family, we have difficult conversations, make complicated decisions, navigate the highs and lows of life. The difference is that we don't need to, and shouldn't have to, resolve our problems in front of cameras." Marcus Williams felt a shiver run down his spine. In 6 years working with Steph, he had never heard him speak with that combination of serenity and power. It was like watching a master in action, someone who had found his center in the middle of the storm. "The photo you saw," Steph paused, allowing the question to hang in the air. "Isha and I were planning our 12-year-old daughter Riley's birthday party. We were discussing whether we should throw a surprise party, where it would be, what theme she would like. I was making a serious face because I was mentally calculating if we could organize everything without her suspecting." The sound of a camera clicking echoed through the room, but this time it seemed louder, more intrusive, as if the technology itself was being exposed for its invasiveness. Steph leaned slightly forward, his hands interlaced on the table, as if he were sharing something important with close friends. But his voice remained loud enough for every person in the room, and every person who would watch the video later, to clearly hear every word. "I need to make something very clear," he said, and something that touches deeply is how his voice carried not just authority, but wisdom that came from years protecting what he loved most. "There is a fundamental difference between Steph Curry, basketball player, and Steph Curry, husband and father." He paused, letting the distinction settle in everyone's mind. "The basketball player belongs to the public. You have the right to know about my points, assists, whether I'm playing well or badly, what strategies I'm using, how I prepare for games. This part of my life I chose to make public when I decided to be a professional athlete." Harvey Levin remained motionless, his face a professional mask, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was beginning to understand that this wouldn't be the interview he had planned. "But Steph Curry, the husband and father, belongs to my family." Steph's voice gained an intensity that made every person in the room pay even more focused attention. "My marriage, my children, our private conversations, our family decisions, our life inside the house, this is sacred territory. And sacred territory is not open for public discussion." Jennifer Walsh, a 15-year veteran covering sports, would later admit she had never witnessed a moment like that. It wasn't just Steph's eloquence or the strength of his conviction. It was the way he could educate without condescending, confront without attacking, establish limits without sounding arrogant. "To you in the media," Steph continued, his voice now directed not just to Harvey, but to the entire room, "I present a challenge. There are infinite real stories to tell about overcoming, hard work, community, inspiration. Why choose to invent drama where none exists? Why create problems in happy families when there are so many true stories waiting to be told? How is it possible that a question can expose not just who asks it, but an entire system that allows it? Steph was doing exactly that, using Harvey's invasive question as a lens to examine the entire culture of intrusion that had become normalized in modern media. "Are you parents?" he asked, his eyes scanning the room. "Do you have families? How would you feel if speculation based on nothing about your private life affected your children? At school? If your kids had to answer questions about invented rumors about you?" The silence that followed was different from the previous silence. It wasn't uncomfortable or tense. It was reflective. It was the silence of people being forced to look in the mirror and question not just what they did, but why they did it. Sarah Mitchell, who had covered the NBA for more than a decade, felt tears forming in her eyes. She had 2 children at home, knew exactly what Steph was saying. Connor Smith crossed his arms, not out of defensiveness, but as if he were hugging himself, processing emotions he hadn't expected to feel at a press conference. "Isha is not just my wife," Steph said, his voice gaining a softness that contrasted with the strength of his previous words. "She is my partner for more than 12 years. She is an incredible mother who wakes up every day thinking first of our daughters. She is a successful businesswoman who built her own career. She is my best friend, the person with whom I share my dreams and my fears." Naturally, this leads us to the moment when you realize that some truths are so powerful, they transform not just who hears them, but who pronounces them. Any close source that suggests otherwise is lying or never truly knew us. Because whoever knows us knows that we built something special, brick by brick, day by day, for 12 years. Harvey Levin, for the first time in 4 decades of journalism career, quietly lowered his pen. It wasn't surrender. It was recognition. Recognition that he had found someone who knew how to play the media game better than himself, but with completely different rules. Steph leaned back in his chair, but his presence seemed to fill the entire room. It was as if he had grown physically during those minutes, not in size, but in moral stature. "I'm going to be very clear about this," he said, his voice carrying a finality that made everyone understand these would be his last words on the subject. "Our family is not entertainment. Our marriage is not content. Our private life is not a product for public consumption." He paused, looking directly at Harvey once more. "Some lines cannot be crossed, not even by public curiosity. And you just discovered where that line is." What happened next was something no camera could adequately capture, but that everyone in the room felt in their souls. It was as if the air had changed quality, as if the very atmosphere was cleaner, clearer. Steph smiled, not a forced or diplomatic smile, but a genuine smile from someone who had just done something important and necessary. "And now," he said, his voice returning to the friendly and accessible tone that characterized his normal press conferences, "let's talk about basketball, which is what you came here for, isn't it?" The laughter that echoed through the room wasn't from nervousness or discomfort. It was from admiration. It was from respect. It was from people who had just witnessed someone defend their values with such absolute dignity that it made them remember their own values. Harvey Levin quietly put away his recorder and left the room without asking any more questions. For the first time in decades, the TMZ founder had been educated about the limits of human curiosity by someone who knew exactly where to draw those lines. The questions that followed were different, respectful, focused on the game, the season, the approaching playoffs, as if everyone in the room had tacitly agreed that something had changed, that new rules had been established. When the press conference ended at 9:47 p.m., Steph stood up, waved to the journalists as he always did, and walked toward the door. In the hallway, he picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Hi, baby," he said when Isha answered. "How was your day?" And it was then that the truth finally came to light. Steph's call to Isha lasted only 3 minutes. 3 minutes of a common conversation between husband and wife after a long day of work. She told him about the meeting with Riley's party coordinator. He mentioned the victory over the Lakers. Nothing extraordinary, nothing dramatic, just the real life of two people who had loved each other for more than 12 years. But those 3 minutes represented something much larger than a simple phone conversation. They represented the normalcy that Steph had just defended so vigorously. The private life he had declared sacred territory just minutes before. You can perceive there was poetic irony in that moment. While the entire world was about to discover what had happened in that press conference, Steph himself was living exactly the simple and authentic life he had protected. While Steph drove home through the silent streets of San Francisco, something extraordinary was happening in the digital world. In less than 2 hours, the video of Steph's response was circulating on all digital platforms. They weren't edited fragments or quotes out of context. It was the complete response, from the first second to the last, preserving every pause, every voice inflection, every chosen word. The first share came from Sarah Mitchell of the Associated Press at 11:28 p.m. She posted the link on Twitter with a single sentence. "I just witnessed a masterclass in dignity and boundaries." Jennifer Walsh from NBC Sports Bay Area followed 15 minutes later. "In 15 years covering sports, I've never seen someone defend their family with such class and firmness." Marcus Williams was in his apartment in San Francisco when his phone began ringing incessantly. First it was colleagues from the sports industry, then journalists from other segments, then TV producers wanting interviews. In 3 hours, he had received more than 50 calls. "Marcus," said Rebecca Thompson, CNN producer, in the first call the next morning. "I need to schedule Steph for the morning show. What he did yesterday goes beyond sports. He redefined how public figures can defend their privacy. Something that touches deeply is how a single courageous voice can awaken millions of other voices that were waiting for permission to speak out." In the first 48 hours, the video had been viewed more than 10 million times. But they weren't just passive views, they were active engagements. Parents sharing with teenage children as an example of how to establish healthy boundaries. Couples discussing privacy in the social media era. Journalists questioning their own professional practices. How is it possible that 12 minutes of a press conference can initiate conversations in millions of homes around the world? Dr. Amanda Foster, psychologist specialized in public figure families, was one of the first academics to comment publicly. Steph Curry demonstrated something we rarely see: how to protect what is sacred without attacking who threatens it. He educated, didn't humiliate, established boundaries, didn't build walls. The Curry family phone wouldn't stop ringing. This time, they weren't calls of concern or morbid curiosity. They were calls of support, admiration, and gratitude. Sonia Curry, Steph's mother, called Saturday morning with her voice choked with emotion. "Son, you made your entire family feel proud. But more than that, you did something that needed to be done a long time ago." Del Curry, his father, sent a simple message. "Yesterday, you played the most important game of your life. And you won." Riley, at 12 years old, had watched the video of her father's response the day after the press conference. Isha found her in the living room, tears in her eyes, watching for the third consecutive time. "Mom," Riley said, her voice choked with emotion. "Dad did this for us, didn't he? He did this for our family, baby, but also for all families that deserve to have their privacy respected." Ryan, 9 years old, might not have fully understood the cultural implications, but understood perfectly the essential message. His father had defended his family when it was necessary. Cannon, at 4 years old, only knew that Daddy had talked seriously with the people on TV, and that this had made Mommy very proud. Have you ever wondered how acts of courage impact not just those who witness them, but especially those who are protected by them? In the Curry family's case, the transformation was immediate and profound. Naturally, this leads us to the moment when we realize that some courageous attitudes create waves that go far beyond their original context. In the days following the press conference, other athletes began referencing Steph's response when they faced invasive questions about their personal lives. Not in a coordinated or planned way, it was organic inspiration that spread through example. Kevin O'Connor, ESPN veteran reporter, published an editorial titled "What Steph Curry Taught Us About Sports Journalism." For decades, we normalized privacy invasion in the name of entertainment. Curry forced us to look in the mirror and question whether curiosity justifies cruelty. Sports Illustrated dedicated a special edition to the theme "Boundaries in the Digital Era," using Steph's response as a case study on how public figures can maintain their humanity without sacrificing professional transparency. But perhaps the most significant impact came from an unexpected source: Harvey Levin himself. 3 weeks after the press conference, Harvey published an editorial on the TMZ website that surprised the entire media industry. The title was simple: "What I Learned at the Press Conference That Changed My Perspective." "In 40 years covering celebrities," he wrote, "I always operated under the premise that public figures give up certain privacy rights. Steph Curry made me realize I had confused legitimate access with unnecessary invasion." Harvey described how, during those 15 seconds of silence in the press room, he had seen himself through Steph's eyes, not as a journalist seeking truth, but as an intruder violating something sacred. "I'm not abandoning investigative journalism," he continued, "but I'm redefining the difference between legitimate public interest and voyeurism disguised as curiosity." The editorial ended with a phrase that would become iconic: "Some lines really cannot be crossed, and sometimes I need someone like Steph Curry to remind me where those lines are." In the following days, something extraordinary began happening in sports coverage. It wasn't an official or mandatory change. It was an organic cultural transformation inspired by Steph's example. Reporters began reformulating invasive questions before asking them. Editors began questioning stories based on speculation about private lives. TV producers began focusing more on stories of overcoming and less on fabricated drama. The Curry Standard became an informal reference in the industry. When a story or question crossed ethical boundaries, colleagues asked, "Would this pass the Curry Standard?" Daniel Patel, sports editor of The Washington Post, implemented specific editorial guidelines. If a story about an athlete's personal life doesn't contribute to understanding their performance or professional character, we don't publish it. How is it possible that a story about a basketball player defending his family resonates with teachers, doctors, lawyers, and ordinary people around the world? The answer was in the universality of human experience that Steph had touched. Everyone, at some point in life, needs to defend something they consider sacred. Everyone faces situations where they must draw lines and decide what is or isn't available for public consumption. Dr. Christopher Lee, sociologist at Stanford University, conducted a study on the Curry effect 6 months after the press conference. His research showed that 78% of respondents reported having rethought their own privacy boundaries on social media after watching Steph's response. Curry demonstrated something social psychology has known for decades, explained Dr. Lee, but that we rarely see applied so effectively. It's possible to be assertive without being aggressive, firm without being rude, protective without being defensive. You can perceive that the most lasting transformations don't come from elaborate speeches or organized campaigns, but from authentic moments where someone simply decides to be true to their values when tested. Steph never planned to become a symbol of dignity in media. He simply responded to the invasion of his privacy the only way he knew how, with honesty, firmness, and moral clarity that came from years protecting what he loved most. Something that touches deeply is how his response didn't attack anyone personally, didn't humiliate Harvey Levin, didn't disrespect the media as an institution. Instead, it educated about boundaries, inspired reflection, and demonstrated that it's possible to defend sacred territories while maintaining class and respect. Naturally, this leads us to the moment when we realize that some courageous attitudes create changes that spread far beyond their point of origin, touching lives and transforming cultures in ways that even those who initiate them cannot completely predict. The first wave had formed. Now it was time to see how it would transform into lasting change. 2 years after that historic press conference, the sports media landscape had changed in measurable ways. Not completely. There were still sensationalist tabloids and unethical reporters, but there was a new awareness, a new conversation about boundaries and respect that didn't exist before that Friday night at Chase Center. Young journalists entering the profession studied Steph's response as an example of how public figures can establish respectful boundaries. Journalism schools included the case in their professional ethics curricula. Marcus Williams, now promoted to Warriors Communications Director, frequently received calls from other advisors asking for advice on how to deal with invasive media. His response was always the same. Remember what Steph did? Honesty, firmness, education. Don't attack, but educate. You can perceive that the deepest changes happen not through decrees or regulations, but through the inspiration that one courageous person can create in millions of others. What had begun as a defensive response from a protective father and husband had transformed into an organic cultural movement. There was no formal organization, no advertising campaigns, no political lobby. There was only the powerful example of someone who had drawn a line and stayed firm on it. At universities around the country, social communication professors used Steph's response video in their classes on journalistic ethics. In media companies, editors implemented new guidelines inspired by the Curry standard. In family homes, parents taught their children about the importance of protecting what is sacred. Dr. Michael Brown, professor of journalistic ethics at Columbia University, published a comprehensive study on Steph's response impact. In 40 years studying media and society, I have rarely seen a single moment create such lasting impact on how we think about privacy and journalistic responsibility. How is it possible that protecting a specific family becomes universal inspiration for millions of people? At Riley's 12th birthday party, a few months after the press conference, the Curry family celebrated not just the oldest daughter's birthday, but the silent victory of having protected their normalcy. The party was exactly as Steph and Isha had planned in that conversation that was photographed and misinterpreted. In their backyard, theme chosen by the birthday girl, school friends, close family. Simple, authentic, full of love. No paparazzi, no speculation, no invasion. During the traditional birthday father's speech, Steph looked around the table, at Isha smiling while Riley opened presents, at Ryan and Cannon laughing at their older sister's jokes, at his own parents and in-laws sharing that special moment, and knew he had made the right choice. Sacred territory remained sacred. Some lines remained untouched, and his family continued being exactly what it had always been. Real, authentic, protected by the love and courage of a man who knew how to distinguish between what belonged to the public and what belonged to the heart. The answer was in the fundamental truth that Steph had touched in that moment. We all have something sacred that deserves protection. We all face moments where we must choose between pleasing others or protecting what we love most. Steph Curry chose to protect, and by making this choice with dignity, education, and firmness, he not only defended his family, he reminded the entire world that it's possible to draw boundaries with class, establish sacred territories with respect, and that some battles are so important they define not just who we are, but who we choose to be. Have you ever wondered how an ordinary person can impact millions of lives simply by being true to their deepest values? Steph's story proved that moral courage, when expressed with authenticity, has the power to awaken moral courage in countless other people. 5 years after the press conference, Harvey Levin and Steph Curry met again, this time at a conference on media ethics in Los Angeles. Harvey approached the stage where Steph had just given a lecture on maintaining humanity in the digital era. "Steph," Harvey said, extending his hand, "I wanted to personally thank you for what you taught me that night." "Harvey," Steph responded, shaking his hand firmly, "thank you for being willing to learn. That made all the difference." It was a simple but powerful moment. Two men who had been on opposite sides of a fundamental line, now united by the understanding that some battles are worth fighting not for the enemies we defeat, but for the values we defend in the process. How is it possible that a 12-minute response can echo for generations? The answer lies in the universal truth that Steph touched. No matter how public our life is, there always exists a sacred core that belongs only to us and those we love. And this core not only can, but must be defended. With love, with courage, and with absolute conviction that some lines really cannot be crossed. Not even by the curiosity of the entire world. Naturally, this leads us to the moment when we realize that the true legacy of that moment wasn't the change in sports media, although it happened. It wasn't the inspiration for other athletes, although it existed. It was the simple and powerful reminder that protecting what we love isn't selfishness. It's humanity in its purest form. Today, when young athletes face privacy invasions, when parents struggle to protect their children from excessive exposure, when anyone needs to draw boundaries in their life, there's an example to follow. There's a 12-minute response that proved it's possible to defend the sacred while maintaining dignity. There's a story that reminds all of us that some things are simply too sacred to be shared, and that defending them not only preserves our own humanity, but inspires others to preserve theirs. Steph Curry showed that some lines cannot be crossed, and by doing so, he not only protected his family, he protected the idea that in an increasingly invasive world, it's still possible to keep sacred what matters most. Some moments define not just who we are, but who we choose to be when tested. That Friday night at Chase Center was one of those moments, and its echo continues reverberating, reminding us that the courage to protect what we love is, perhaps, the purest form of courage that exists. Some lines cannot be crossed, not even by the curiosity of the entire world. And sometimes, I need someone like Steph Curry to remind us where those lines are.